First of all, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today we are going to have a brief webinar synopsis of a new profile which was approved in October of last year. The profile is called the Import and Display of External Priors, or IDEP. So we have two primary goals for this particular webinar. The first is to invite all of you and anyone else who's interested for that matter to join us in helping to develop the IDEP profile for public comment. And we'll get into schedules a bit later. But right now what we have is we have a lot of solid ideas that have been talked through and thought through, but definitely still need a bit more work. To get to that point, what we are planning to do is to give you a high-level overview of the current scope and the technical solution as it stands today for IDEP, with the intention of piquing your curiosity and interest to let you join us. So the value proposition for IDEP. First of all, if you're Canadian, you've probably heard of this before, called Foreign Exam Management, or FEM. It's a very similar concept. So the value proposition for IDEP is that in today's world, people are mobile. And patients are mobile. So radiology studies have a tendency to exist in multiple different healthcare institutions. That can mean that they are on different PACS systems. They may be on different PACS systems even within the same healthcare system. The different studies may have different patient identifiers, different procedure codes. Today, those studies may be accessible through a DVD. You often hear it called a DICOM CD or a DICOM DVD. Or even accessible through a web portal. But that's not the same as having a radiology comparison, which is available side by side on the Radiology PACS workstation for radiology interpretation at the time when that study is being interpreted. IDEP has chosen to focus on the installed base and on adoption. The intent is that we make installed base systems work better, preferably without having to change them. We concentrate on this particular profile on the triggers and how to make things move around in an automated fashion. We have done quite a bit of work on format conversions, especially for reports. We'll get into that in a minute as well. But the intent is that we don't require changes or upgrades to current PACS systems, so that the adoption of IDEP will hopefully go much more quickly and much more smoothly. So the problem statement for IDEP. As we said, it's, excuse me, it's very common for prior radiology reports as well as studies to be located at other institutions. The ability to locate and access and view these directly is a very short time frame when that is functional and is of use to the radiologist. So going to a DVD and trying to import a DVD or look at a different monitor or look on a web portal isn't the correct way to do things. Often radiologists are going to do measurements. They want to use the measurement tools that they're used to, so they want to also use the hanging protocols that they're used to on their PACS system, so side-by-side comparison is often necessary for interpretation. Even if a DICOM DVD or DICOM CD or web portal is available to view the radiology images, often the prior radiology reports aren't accessible today, and that's a goal that we also have for IDEP, which is to include not only the images but also the reports. Finally, when the images or the reports are not available for at the time of interpretation, the patient may need to be re-imaged. That can include additional exposure to radiation and most likely includes additional cost and time. We're going to go through a specific example, which is an oncology example. David,
yeah.
Dr. Koff, are you on the line?
Yeah, I'm on the line.
Do you want to walk through this one?
Yes. So what I want to do is to give you the radiologist perception and working in a busy cancer center. This is really a priority for us. So we had the question, why do we need that right now? What has changed? Why do we really need to create this profile? And I can tell you that radiologists working in such an environment has to see a lot of CT. There are more and more images, more and more complex. and we have to be able to have a faster turnaround time for our report. One of the issues with CDs, very often they go to what is the film library now, and they have to be imported in the packs, and in our organization, for instance, can take up to 2 to 3 days, which is unacceptable. So we want to have access to the images timely. When you do function in the same organization, that's easy because you have your images. But if your patients are coming from a community, and for the Canadians here, they know that the trend is to do as much as possible in the community now, is to try to keep the patient close to home. So a lot of imaging is done in community hospitals, and then the patient would come for the consultation, have one CT done at the cancer center, or even the prior imaging is done in the community, the original imaging, and the radiologist will have to be able to compare the images for the oncologist. And very often there is not much time to do that, so it has to be quick and efficient. The big frustration is to have to open a web interface where the images won't have the same quality, or you won't be able to compare the measurements because you don't use the same tools. And very often it's not the same environments, it's not the same vendor, and the radiologist is struggling, having to look at the images on their own packs and compare with something which is very different. You cannot do cross-referencing, you cannot compare your MPRs, and you cannot adjust the measurement the same way, which can be critical when you're looking for small metastatic disease or peritoneal seeding, which change over time. So that may have an impact. And that happens again and again because the patient is usually coming back every 3 to 6 months. So I don't even talk about the speed of downloading the images when you have to look at 2,000 or 3,000 images and have to wait for the web interface to open. So it has really been identified as a priority for us if we want to be efficient, to be able to have these images displaying in our own environment the same way that if they were done on site. Have the same hanging protocol, and of course have access to the previous report. So we just took the oncology example, but I can tell you it's even more critical sometimes in the emergency setting where you only have you don't have a previous CD, you don't have any other way to see the previous then to bring it compare with the current. So that's why we identified the need for IDEP as a priority, and I'm very happy that this profile has been approved. So Teri, maybe to go back in more technical considerations.
I'm sorry, what was that last comment?
I give it back to you for the more technical considerations.
Got it, thank you. Okay, so thank you. So to back to the more technical side of things again, some of the concepts that we discussed when actually developing the profile for IDEP include the relationship of IDEP to an existing IHE radiology profile called the Import and Reconciliation Workflow, or IRWF.B profile, and which focuses on importing DICOM DVDs in quite successfully. However, IDEP has the addition of the automated triggers and searches, determining relevancy, which is something we'll discuss in a bit more detail, the fact that the display requirements have to be met to be side by side to really be effective, and potentially including life cycle management or retention of the studies and reports. Relevancy in this profile isn't something that we prescribe to say this is what defines a relevant study, because it's something that we don't feel that the IHE Radiology Technical Committee should be doing. We give some ideas for data elements that we think should be used in determining relevancy, but that is something outside the scope of the profile, and in fact, it's something that a product will be able to use to say, to differentiate themselves from other products and say, our rules are more flexible to let you define what your institution believes to be relevant. So that's not, the word relevant is not defined precisely within this document. We have no intentions of trying. We want to be able to ensure that side-by-side proper display, including the ability to use local hanging protocols, will work. As Dr. Koff described earlier, how important it is to be able to do the measurements the same way at the same time. And to do that, we define a set of attributes, DICOM attributes, which will go through conversions so that they appear local, such that the side-by-side hanging protocols will work. We will talk about in the concept section a very interesting subject, radiology reports. It includes different types of transport, being, for example, an HL7 version 2 ORU. It could be a DICOM secondary capture. It could be a DICOM SR. It could be a DICOM Part 20 CDA, as well as the format conversion, because there's multiple variables when it comes to reports, because there is no standardized interface to this quite the same way that there is as DICOM for images. So the radiology reports section will probably end up being half of the profile in the long run, but that's okay. We need to get it worked out. Other concepts that we discuss in IDEP are the retention of prior studies and reports from an architectural, legal, and jurisdictional point of view, and the fact that it will be different in different countries and even in different states in the United States. We discuss maintaining consistency of content. So if we pull a study locally, but it changes on the remote archive or the originating site, we discuss how to at least illustrate what the issues are and talk about how IOCM could potentially help solve those issues. We discuss the access control for prior studies and reports and the fact that there has to be potentially has to be patient permission to share that data in advance, again, depending on legal and jurisdictional issues. There was quite a bit of discussion about different deployment models within a hospital, the fact that there can be multiple hospitals within one PAC system, so you may even want to deploy IDEP within a single hospital. You may want to deploy IDEP across a healthcare enterprise. So for example, one hospital system acquires another hospital system, and they have two different PAC systems, and yet their marketing people put on the front page of the local newspaper that they are now sharing radiology images between the different institutions, and now they need to make it work. Another example is a regional or health information exchange type example where hospital systems within a certain region have agreed to share radiology studies. In addition to that, from a technical point of view, you can also look at IDEP deployment as centralized or as an edge architecture, and that's something that we'll get into in the following web sequence diagrams. The point of this, however, is that in every IHE profile, there's a section 4, which is called the concept section. In this particular profile, that section is going to be very important. It's going to be longer than most, but it's going to be very important just because there's a lot of different variations and ways that we could deploy IDEP at different institutions. So, the components of a technical solution for IDEP. There are certain decisions that are reasonably well made and reasonably well formed at this point, and they include that when we go out in search of additional patients for patient IDs for a particular patient, that we're going to use the ITI profiles of PICS and PDQ. We've determined that DICOM is going to be the default or the required method, the baseline method for accessing imaging studies, that XDSI will be an option for accessing imaging studies, that the ITI profile mobile health documents, which is a FHIR-based profile, that will be the default or required for results access, for the reports access. There is no query in HL7 version 2, which makes it difficult to use HL7 version 2, and many reports are not stored in DICOM format. And so we've decided to just take a jump and move to the FHIR standard because all the existing standards for the installed base are a little more difficult to use. that does not mean that we won't be able to convert the results locally to be an HL7 ORU, for example. The report
Teri,
format
is that both, Teri, this is Lynn, is that both query and retrieve from using MHD? Is that correct?
Yep, that's our
query
plan.
for and retrieve. Okay.
Yep. And even send, for that matter, kind of forward. The results formats that we are including in this particular profile are within scope, include the DICOM structure report, DICOM secondary capture, plain text, which is probably going to be an HL7 ORU, PDF format, which can be either the transport format can be either DICOM or HL7 version 2, and then finally DICOM part 20, which is really an HL7 level 3 CDA document. We decided that as part of this profile that we will go off and verify if prior studies already exist locally before moving data around again, primarily because these studies are large and we're trying to be careful of bandwidth issues. We are going to list and include all of the HL7 and DICOM attributes which we require and or recommend be coerced such that the studies appear locally. And then finally, we decided that we will define named options for data retention to determine whether or not external prior studies and reports can and should be automatically deleted. And that, again, is defined as a named option because there'll be certain jurisdictions where if you use a report or a study for legal interpretation that you can't delete it. All right. The sequence diagrams for IDEP are long. Because there's a lot of things going on and there's a lot of different transactions between a lot of different systems. It is not my intent to walk through every sequence diagram that we've done because there are too many. So instead, we're just going to walk through the happy path, and my intent is to introduce all the sequence diagrams, introduce the steps, as opposed to walk through all of the different transactions. So just to kind of introduce the sequence diagrams, over to the left we have the local systems, a department system scheduler, a local image manager, which is your PAC system probably, and a local report manager. So this blue line right here kind of defines the systems to the left as being the local systems. The systems off to the right, there's typically going to be one of each of these systems which are considered to be the local system. Off to the right we have the remote systems. This can be one remote set of systems. This can be 300 remote systems, depending on the scope of your installation and deployment. So there's going to be a remote image manager, and there's going to be a remote report manager. In the middle, we have a centralized system, which is the PICS manager, or the ability to look up different patient IDs. And then here I have a dashed line. And the dashed line indicates that these two new actors for IDEP, which are an import manager, which is the new actor, which is the intelligent actor to go out and figure out what other studies exist for this world and how to convert them locally, and a report converter, which doesn't ever touch the images, but as the name implies, it is able to convert both the format and the protocol for the various reports to be able to store them back to the local report manager. There are arguments to be made, and this profile will just remain silent on whether or not these systems should be deployed centrally or they should be deployed as edge devices for local systems. It is our intent that either model will work and that both models will be supported. Excuse me. All right, so to jump into the sequence diagrams themselves. These yellow bars, text across the top, kind of the intent of those is to tell you what's coming next and why we're doing a transaction. So the first thing that's going to happen. So the first thing that's going to happen is that at the local department system scheduler, a new order is going to be entered into the DSSOF, and that new order, which is a very standard HL7 ORM message, will be distributed to a whole bunch of systems, one of which will include this new actor called an import manager. Now, maybe that order was scheduled 6 months out. Time's going to pass, and closer to the date of the procedure, our new import manager is going to go off and it's going to say, are there other patient IDs for this patient? It'll query the PICS manager, and it'll get back a response with alternate patient IDs. Then the import manager is going to go off and attempt to discover whether or not there are additional prior studies at other remote systems. So although in this sequence diagram, this query for imaging studies to a remote image manager is going to a single system, chances are it's really going to a lot more than one system, depending on the scope of the installation at a particular site. It may be going to 2, it may be going to 20. Oops, I lost my cursor. So the response to the query for the imaging studies contains the metadata for all the studies which exist at all the various remote systems. And then it is up to the import manager to use its logic to determine at a very broad level which of those prior studies are relevant. Now I'm going to pause here for a second and say, as part of the concept section, we recommend that the import manager be a bit lenient, if you will, on determining what's relevant. And the local image manager may go through another set of relevancy determination as part of the hanging protocols. And so it's part of our advice in the concept section to, when in doubt whether something's relevant or not, send it on to the local system, just in case they decide that it's useful. All right. So continuing on with the sequence diagrams for IDEP, the next set of steps includes that we're going to go after and we're going to check if these external studies have already been imported locally. If not, we're going to go out and retrieve the external studies which we've already determined to be relevant. We'll go out and we'll coerce the DICOM attributes so that they appear local, and then we'll create new orders for these external studies so that the local systems work better. So in a bit more detail, we have, starting again at the import manager, the import manager is going to query the local image managers to say, does that study exist? If that study doesn't exist locally, we're going to go off and retrieve the images from the remote managers, and then go through the whole DICOM attribute coercion process. In this IDEP profile, there'll be a list of attributes which are required to be coerced to appear local. It's very similar to what's in IRWF, the import reconciliation workflow, as well as a list of recommended attributes. Once the import manager has taken a look at all the DICOM instances and objects and coerced the attributes to be local, it's going to go off and go through all the normal steps to send it to a local image manager. That's going to include creating a new order for the local image manager, doing MPPS, actually sending the images themselves, and then completing storage commitment. The next set of steps that we get into for the sequence for IDEP includes the results retrieval. And this gets a little bit more complex and a little bit less familiar with what IHE Radiology is used to doing, again, because there was no great intuitive method to use like an HL7 query, for example, and most results are not stored in DICOM. So as I mentioned earlier, what we decided to do was to incorporate the ITI profile MHD, which is really a FIRE profile if you look at the transactions. So we have grouped the IDEP import manager with an MHD document consumer and a document source. We have grouped the remote report manager as an MHD document responder. How that remote report manager actually gets those reports is outside of the scope of this profile, but chances are it's receiving HL7 version 2 ORU messages. If it's, and it could also be an XDS repository. There's actually quite a few different ways that this report manager could access those documents. It can be a database. It could be an EMR. In any event, the import manager is going to take a look at the studies which it's already forwarded, the DICOM objects it's already forwarded, use the external, whoops, where's my cursor? Use the external accession number, and then it's going to perform an ITI 67 query to the remote report manager and retrieve those documents from which are the results from the remote report manager. It's going to bring that information back to the import manager, go through a very similar metadata coercion algorithm, and then send that report information to this report converter. So we haven't talked much at all yet about this report converter actor. The report converter actor is the actor which understands how to convert all of the reporting protocols as well as some of the report formats. It's still up in the air, I should say we're still working through the details of determining exactly which report formats will be required and which ones will be named options so that products can differentiate themselves. To require everything, we're concerned would just be overwhelming because there's a lot of different variables.
Yep, and Teri, this is Lynn. Then when you select those formats, you're going to have a mapping table to the document reference and manifest submission requirements, you know, all those attributes. Is that how that works?
We haven't gotten that far yet.
Okay, you'll just need it. That's fine. Okay.
Yeah, that's the intent. I don't know how far we're going to take that because that's opening Pandora's box in a big way. So we may just say that certain types of conversions are outside the scope of the document because otherwise we're afraid we may never finish. We're not sure about that yet.
Okay.
We have several tables which show the intersection of which formats are even possible and which are not. And that's something that we're still working through.
Yeah.
As an example,
you're probably going to need that. You're probably going to need that mapping, even though you don't want to do it. But okay.
As an example, we said DICOM secondary captures cannot be converted to an HL7 CDA level 3 document because it's not possible to do it. The information's not there.
Oh, I'm just talking about MHD mapping to MHD submission.
I think we'll probably have to do that.
Okay. Well, we can get out of the weeds so you can continue, but okay.
So after we've done the mapping that Lynn is referring to, the report converter will understand probably through an impressive configuration table the format that the local report manager needs that document in, and it will send either as another MHD document bundle to the local report manager. It'll send it as an HL7 version 2 ORU through the send results transaction, or it may send it as a DICOM object, such as a DICOM secondary capture, a DICOM structured report, to the local report manager, depending on what the local report manager requires. All right, next step in the sequence. As we have said a couple times, there's potential legal issues in some countries and in some states determining whether or not we can, in fact, purge studies or purge reports which have been used in a primary interpretation. So we have chosen to create a named option instead of making this a requirement because there are some facilities which have access to those images again and don't want to duplicate and have to try and maintain consistency of studies and objects between multiple systems. So there will be a named option to be able to delete, or I should say purge, prior DICOM objects as well as purge prior reports. And there will not be any transactions associated with those named options. That'll be internal to those actors. But they'll have to put on an IHE conformance statement whether or not they're capable of doing it. All right, so a summary of the named options. We will have XDS as for retrieval of images and reports as a named option. We are still trying to determine which of the results or the report transport conversions will be required versus options, similar to the results payload formats being required versus options. And then finally, we have made the decision that DICOM Part 20 Level 3 CDA will be a specific named option, if only because it enables systems to call out their features, and that's something that we want to promote is the DICOM Level 3, HL7 Level 3 CDA options. And as a potential addition, just in case we don't have enough going on in this profile just yet, it's been brought up as a question about can we add an additional trigger so that currently the only trigger is a new order from the local DSSOF. And do we want to use a manual federated query from the local PACS system? So in this particular example, a technologist or a radiologist sitting at a PACS workstation, for whatever reason, perhaps the patient made a comment or a physician made a comment that they believe that external priors exist at a related site, that they want to do a manual search to go out and look for the relevant priors. As of right now, this particular idea of having a manual federated query as the initial trigger is outside the scope of this. Time permitting, we might include it. Or we might boot it in as an addition for next year. So finally, in conclusion, we need help, especially on the clinical side, determining what's important, especially on the results side of determining what's important in the IDEP. The face-to-face meeting for the technical committee is coming up in early February, February 5th to February 8th. The public comment period for this profile will be sometime in mid-March, and the intention is to publish for trial implementation this coming summer. Any questions? All right, in that case, I thank you for your time. And if you have any questions, there's 2 different email addresses on here that you can get a hold of either myself or the radiology committee at, and we look forward to hearing from you at the next face-to-face meeting.